Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzy Ostwald. Video games invite the player into a virtual world that sometimes includes fantasizing about committing immoral actions. Is this wrong, or is it problematic? These are some of the questions that the topic of a new book, Video Games, Violence, and the Ethics of Fantasy, by my guest, Dr. Chris Bartell, will explore. And welcome, Chris. I'm really happy to have you here today. I'm excited about your new book. I read it a month ago, and it's excellent.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me.
And I wanted to point out here the subtitle, which is especially catching, Killing Time, which
thank you.
has a double meaning at least, right?
Yes, yes. I'm so glad somebody caught that.
Yeah.
I'd be so disappointed if nobody got, yeah. But thank you.
Yeah, the other neat thing about your book is the dedication. To your parents, and I think you said who bought you that Atari 2600
Yes.
when you were at an impressionable
All
age.
of this is their fault.
Yeah.
Right? They bought me that Atari 2600 in the early 80s.
That's
and
great. So
it's
you
been
are a
downhill
gamer
since.
then.
I am.
A lifelong gamer. You still play.
Yep.
So you've kind of seen this evolution of video games from where it once was in its infancy to now, where there's so many realistic graphics and storylines and whatnot.
Yes,
So,
I have. I started playing games in the early 80s with the Atari 2600, and I played through the big console. The way that gamers like the way that we map time is by talking about different console releases.
Right.
So it starts. There were consoles before the Atari 2600, but that's where I started. And then the next big console was the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the Sega Genesis came out around that time too. And actually after that point is when I went to college, and I stopped playing games while I was in college and didn't pick it up again until I got to graduate school, which was the GameCube and the Nintendo 64 with big consoles then. And then I've been playing pretty steadily ever since.
Yeah, you're speaking a language that I'm not familiar with,
sorry.
but I am familiar with video games, and
Good,
I've played a few in my time. But you're not a professional video gamer, you're a professional philosopher. So
Bizarre,
how did you bring this hobby or love of video games together with your philosophy and what you're writing and teaching? That's really interesting.
Thank you. That's a great question too, because I often wonder about this myself. Like, how did I get here? Because when I mention to people that I'm a scholar of video games, that is just mind blowing. Like, that there is such a thing as video game scholars, but there are. So I actually, when I started doing philosophy, was really interested in philosophy of art. And particularly, I'm also a musician, so I mainly studied philosophy of music, and I've always been interested in how people react to and respond to works of art, particularly in music. I was initially driven to get into philosophy because I was curious if my musical training means that I actually hear sound differently from non-musicians do. Because I've noticed like different arguments that I've had with people about albums or pieces of music, and it always struck me as like, how could you not hear the thing that happened in the song? How could you not hear that? And it made me wonder if maybe my training means that I listen differently, or I listen with a different kind of attention or something like that. So I got into philosophy because I realized that I couldn't answer those questions about music by just playing more music. So I spent the early part of my career really focusing on things to do with philosophy and music. And I constantly felt this sense of guilt because I wasted so much time playing video games. And it really was just kind of by accident. It was about 10 or 12 years ago that I wanted to, this sounds so ridiculous, but I wanted to spice up one of my classes for my undergraduates. And I thought, there's got to be some interesting work out there about video games. I wonder what's happening. So I started looking through what has been written about video games and philosophy, and I found that there wasn't an awful lot, but I found this one essay that just completely captured my attention. And if you don't mind, I'll just take a brief minute to explain.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's an essay by a colleague, Morgan Luck. It's called The Gamer's Dilemma. and it presents this moral problem with video gaming. And the problem just captured my imagination so much that I really I wanted to solve this problem. And through wanting to solve that problem, I ended up getting sucked into game studies entirely. So the gamer's dilemma is the problem that there are lots of video games where you can do immoral things. You can do really awful things. You can commit acts of murder. And in the game, the important thing is that in the game, it's understood in the game that this is an act of murder. It's an unnecessary killing. It's not self-defense. It's not an act of war. It's just a full-blown, voluntary murder. And gamers will typically say it's morally permissible to do things like this because nobody's really harmed, because it's not real, because it's fictional. And Morgan Luck noticed that the logic of that argument, that because nobody is harmed, means that I should be able to get away with lots of stuff. I mean, why limit yourself to virtual murder? What about virtual pedophilia? Right? So then the dilemma is, we intuitively feel this sense that murder is permissible because nobody's harmed. On the other hand, virtual pedophilia sounds disgusting, and that should never be permissible. But how do I defend that? How do I make the moral argument that I can do one thing, but I can't do the other, especially if you've already bought into the logic of nobody is harmed?
Right.
So the gamer's dilemma is either you believe that because nobody is harmed means that you can do anything in games, up to and including virtual pedophilia, or you have to find some way to distinguish one thing from the other so that murder is permissible, but pedophilia is not. And I wanted an answer to that so badly that I ended up writing a book.
Right. So, I mean, in your philosophy, then, do you distinguish between what we would see as immoral acts? Here, you mentioned two: murder, pedophilia. I think rape, lesser offenses, theft. Do you, in your work, make moral distinctions between these acts, or is there something else going on here with the fantasy that's being perpetuated in the game?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one really tricky question that I don't want to answer, and I don't think I have to answer, is anything really morally wrong? Like, what is it that makes things morally wrong? That's such a tough question. Yeah. But you actually don't need to worry about that question so much, because one of the ways to think about this is that when you're playing a video game, the thing that you're doing in the game, you could think of it as being genuinely morally wrong if it would be genuinely morally wrong if you did that thing in real life. So think of self-defense. We have complex feelings about self-defense. Sometimes we think it's permissible. Sometimes we think that you've overstepped the line. But generally speaking, most people, I think, have a sense that, of course, you should be able to defend yourself up to some point, whatever that point is. Or acts of war. Acts of war are something that we regret, we acknowledge this is a bad thing, but we wouldn't think that it's necessarily immoral, right? You might think that an act of war is regrettable, but we don't call that murder. On the other hand, just going on a killing spree because you're bored is obviously a bad thing. It's obviously something that if it happened in real life, we would say that's wrong. And the fact that video games allow me to do this means that it really allows me to live out things that are genuinely immoral in the game world.
Right. So is that necessarily harmful, I guess, would be one question to the player, because it sounds almost like what you have here is an imaginary world where you can work out some of these moral dilemmas, right? If you're making the claim that if it's immoral in the real world, it should be immoral in the video game, does the video game then become a vehicle through which one can work out moral dilemmas?
Yes.
Without harming someone, and then
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So it's morally instructive, or could be.
It can be, and this is something that I absolutely love about video games. And part of what kind of motivates my interest in games is that they really can be an incredibly powerful moral tool where we get to understand ourselves, understand how we Think about different scenarios where you can really act out scenarios and figure out what kind of person would I be in this case. One of the points that I make in the book is that the book begins with this really general question: is it ever morally wrong to fantasize about immoral things? Right? And that's a very general question. And one of the key points that I want to make in the book is that there is no general answer to that question. Right? It really depends on the case. It really depends on what is it that's motivating somebody to go through this act of imagination. There are really good, morally innocent reasons why somebody would fantasize about something immoral. Like, for instance, imagine that you're a juror on a murder trial, and a hypothetical comes up. It's perfectly morally innocent, of course, to think about that hypothetical and think about what would be right or wrong in that hypothetical scenario. Or, as a way of working out fears, right. Morally innocent to fantasize about something immoral. Yeah. But the other point that I want to make is, while there are morally innocent reasons to fantasize about something immoral, there are also morally culpable reasons. There are other reasons to fantasize about things that probably aren't as, aren't as innocent and wholesome as the other cases that I just mentioned. Right.
Well, I think at one point in the book, you make a statement that caught my eye. You said if committing an immoral act in the fantasy world creates immoral desires in the player, then you have to consider that not a moral action. Yeah. And I've paraphrased it poorly, but I thought that was really a kind of really good perspective, and maybe you could build a little bit on that. What do you mean by creating immoral desires?
Sure. So there's I have to back up a little bit and first think about how lots of works of fiction can act as a fantasy. People fantasize about things all the time. Sometimes we fantasize about things by accident. Sometimes, just a random thought pops into your head and you don't really think much about it, and maybe it's a thought that even disturbs you, but you just kind of shuffle it aside and never return to it. But there are other fantasies people have that they come back to over and over again, and they rehearse. It's like a little story that you tell yourself before you go to bed at night, while you're falling asleep, or whatever it might be. Yeah. Those fantasies, the ones that we rehearse, the ones that we develop over years or decades, seem like they're important. Like, they seem like they're a solid part of our psychology. It's like part of the furniture of your brain, right? It's part of the furniture of whatever your personality is. That there's something about this scenario that you're fantasizing about that is important to you, that somehow captures something that you desire or fear or whatever it might be. So with that, if you buy that, and I don't know that everybody does buy that, but if you buy that idea that some fantasies are actually kind of based on our desires, and we go through this fantasy as a way of working out our desires, then you can actually turn to fiction as a way of rehearsing those fantasies. You can find works of fiction that kind of play into the fantasy that you have. Right. And one of the powerful things about fiction is that it's powerful to recognize that other people have this thought too, right? It's a work of art that's out there in the world. Somebody else dreamed this up. We share something. We share this fantasy for this thing. It kind of is a validating moment to realize that I'm not the only one who feels this way. Yeah. Then it matters what the content of the fantasy is. So when I talk about violence in video games, this happens with my students all the time. When I talk about violence in video games, the students usually have a couple of stock examples that they want to talk about. Really popular video game is Grand Theft Auto. In Grand Theft Auto, you play as a gang leader, and you deal drugs, you kill other gang members, you steal cars, you do all sorts of really terrible, immoral things. Right. And it's a game that people often point to as, this is an example of a violent video game. And That is true. It's a violent video game, but I like to point out to the students that in terms of violence, Grand Theft Auto ain't nothing. There is way darker stuff out there.
Right.
There are rape video games. There really is. There's an entire genre. There is such a thing as
That's
rape.
disturbing.
Yeah, there are rape video games. There are pedophilia video games.
Oh.
Those things. There are white supremacist video games. There are lots of these things.
So-
And so my point is, these are fantasies.
Okay.
These are things that somebody desires. And maybe it's not a good idea to rehearse these desires.
Yeah, so when I hear you say there are rape video games, and that's a genre, they're white supremacist video games, that really disturbs me, concerns me.
Yeah.
And some of the times what I hear from scholars and parents and others who are concerned about some of these games is that there might be some sort of cause and effect link, or that playing these games and fantasizing about them might desensitize the player to these acts, and there might be some sort of link then moving from fantasy to reality. Does that concern you, or is there data out there to suggest that this is a danger?
Yeah, I'm really interested in that.
Yeah.
And the short answer is that the data on that is a mess. Like, there's data that kind of goes in both directions on this. Within the media ethics scholarly community, there's been a lot of work on desensitization, and there isn't really a clear answer that desensitization happens. I'm kind of tempted, I really would love to know if it happens. When we talk about desensitization, what we typically have in mind is the idea that, like, how do you imagine that it works? Think of, like, how would desensitization work? It couldn't be that, like, a happy-go-lucky kid who lives in a lovely, loving and supportive family sits down and plays a game for an hour, and after that, he's become desensitized and now can't tell the difference between kindness and murder.
Yeah.
Right? That's not how it works. But I wonder if there's any data, and I don't know this, I wonder if there's any data or any possibility that it works on generational levels. I remember this one time I was talking to my dad about this, like really early when I was first writing the book, and I was telling my dad about it. And he said he's really glad that I'm writing this book, because he went to my brother's house and saw one of his grandkids playing a game, and the game disgusted him. Like, the amount of violence in the game was just, he had to walk out of the room. He couldn't handle it. And I kind of thought that was interesting, that I wonder if desensitization is a generational thing, that like, kids seem able to handle this stuff that makes my dad feel nauseous.
Right. Well, I know I might have the same reaction if I saw the video game, but when I was a kid, I ran through the woods shooting my Tommy gun at my playmates, and we played war all the time. And in some ways, that might even be more real than the fantasy world.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things about video games now is they're so realistic. My first video game was Pong. And,
Nice, good.
and I had Pong and I had baseball, and that was it.
Excellent.
But the graphics now are I mean, it's just so realistic, and I guess that might blur the lines a little bit between the imaginary world and the real world.
So I think two answers to this question.
Yeah.
First, I think you're probably right that the graphicness is something that grabs us, and that can really enhance a sense of disgust or a sense of wrongness of what's happening in the game. But other part of the answer is, funnily enough, controversy over video game violence goes back all the way to 1976.
Really?
Yeah, the first video game that caused a national controversy was called Death Race. I think it was Death Race 2000 is the name of the game. And it's a game where the graphics are terrible. It's like as good as Pong was. You drive this very blocky looking thing that's sort of a car,
Right.
or it's supposed to be car shaped, and you run over things that are kind of people shaped. And when you run them over, they turn into, like, I think, little skull shapes or something like that. And in 1976, people were furious about this, that it's a game where you run over pedestrians for fun. So it was the first morally problematic game.
Yeah. and just the beginning of the controversies over whether or not these games are morally problematic. You write at one point that sometimes you do things in games that make you feel remorse.
Yeah.
Guilt.
Weirdly,
is it the same guilt or more? So is that's got to be some kind of signal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's.
Now that you ask, I have to wonder myself: is it guilt that I feel, or is it something else, or is it something just like discomfort? So I'll give you an example. In the video game Grand Theft Auto 4. Right, it's a game where you play as a drug dealer, and one of the missions that you have to complete in the game, in order to complete the main storyline of the game, there's one mission that you have to go through where you help the Irish mafia rob a bank, and the bank robbery goes bad, and the police show up, and then you have to shoot your way out, and that means that you have to shoot police officers.
Right.
And the first time I played the game, I didn't want to shoot police officers. I felt really awful about that. So I tried to see if I could sneak out, or if I could, stealthily, like climb out a window. And it turned out that the game just prevents you from doing that. The only way to complete this mission is by killing every cop.
So it forces you to make moral choices then.
Interestingly, video games are often described as places where the player has the freedom to make all sorts of choices, but actually you don't.
Right.
You don't have nearly as much freedom as you think you do. In Grand Theft Auto, you can steal anything in sight and kill anybody that you see, but you can't give up the thug life and go back to community college, right? You don't really have freedom. So no, the way that I put it in the book is that there are certain games that coerce us into certain forms of violence. Like I had to shoot the police to get through this mission. The only other choice was I turn off the game, right? And I find it really interesting that players. It happens often in games that a game will put a player in a scenario that makes them uncomfortable, but the player will often go through with it anyways. And it's a complex psychology of what's going on. It might be that for the most part, I'm having fun with this game, or I'm committed to the story, and I really want to see how the story plays out, but I have to get through this one scene that I don't really want to do, so I just kind of detachedly press the buttons and get through the game and get on to the next thing.
Now, you don't write about religion specifically, but you do write about moral choices and virtue ethics, and these are things that religions are concerned with. So I know that some games will put you into a religious worldview, in essence, or put you into a situation, I think, is it Assassin's Creed, where you're in the middle of the Crusades or something,
yes.
so you've got religious wars going on. What's going on there? How are religions depicted in these games? I could see where there might be the occasion for reinforcing certain stereotypes about certain religions or religious figures even. Is that part of what's...
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't study this exactly, but I do know of other scholars who do. And yeah, there is some degree of... there can be, of course, some degree of stereotyping. There are other games that really, work against stereotype. One of the interesting things about the game is that, particularly if you're playing a game that puts you in a religious context that you are not already yourself a part of, and you have to play from that point of view, it could be that video games can give us an interesting way to understand, the cultures of others, if they're well-designed games, right? If they're, if they actually make this part of their design.
So I might play a game where I become a Muslim, and I would have to learn enough about a Muslim worldview to be able to make proper moral choices from that perspective.
Exactly.
That's
or
really...
to see like what kind of moral conundrums might arise given what kind of religious commitments that you have.
So there could be some educational value in dealing with religions, and also, nice. This could actually lead to, I would think, more tolerance toward other beliefs, even, or more acceptance, or just more knowledge about other beliefs.
And like I said, I know that there are scholars who are studying this stuff. I don't study it myself, but I know that there are people doing this.
Right.
I don't know what results they've got. I apologize.
But no, it's a similar sort of dilemma that you were talking about earlier. If you're challenged to think about things from a different perspective, then it does have this possibility, at least, of broadening one's views and making you reflect about these moral issues from a different perspective. So I'm glad to hear that, because that makes me think there's some real possibility, real positive things that could be going on here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like I said, it comes down to, for me, the moral questions about, what are you doing in the game really comes down to what is it that motivates you to do these things in a game. If I'm shooting at the police officers in Grand Theft Auto 4, I felt really awful about that. It's not what I wanted to do. It's not a reflection of who I am. It's not a reflection of what I value. I felt really bad about that. Now imagine a player who really enjoys it.
Yeah.
Right? Who that's what they want. That's the world they want to live in. This is really, it speaks to them. It really captures something that they value about the world. That person, I think, actually does have a degree, weirdly, a degree of moral responsibility, because what they're doing is they're expressing their values in this game, and then what we can look at that person and ask, are these good values? Are these things that ought to be valued?
And just to switch gears slightly a little bit, and go back to something we said earlier on, how you came into this study. You were putting together your interest and your professional training. In the book, you mentioned that there's no real video game discipline, right? Scholars come from psychology and philosophy and I don't know, education, and they're studying video games and the effects of video games on gamers from different perspectives. Do you ever reach consensus on things?
No,
or is it,
no, not that, not that I'm aware of.
I mean, I would think that would be, on the one hand, frustrating, right? Because you find it difficult to talk to people from other disciplines, but on the other hand, you're getting a wealth of perspective on this that you might not otherwise have.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who describe themselves as video game scholars, and there is a growing body of scholarship around video game studies. But there isn't, the way that I describe it is that it's not an area of study that has an academic core, where there's one academic discipline that is somehow central to that study. Like, it's not psychology, it's not philosophy, it's not media studies, it's not any of these things. There is no one academic discipline that is the obvious starting point for video game studies.
Right. No, there's no PhD in video games.
Right. Well, there is now.
Ah.
You can get a PhD in game studies. I think it's the University of Copenhagen.
Ah.
Which is a lovely place to go to university.
I would say, yes. Yeah, so, I mean, you're kind of on the cusp of a new field of study in some way. So do you see yourself as a groundbreaker or a pioneer here?
No, I don't.
Okay.
And because the funny thing is that philosophy has actually been really slow to pick up interest in video game studies. There have been people doing video game studies since it's been decades. There's lots of early stuff written in the 90s, even further back in the 80s. There are people that have been talking about this for quite some time, but not in philosophy. Philosophical work comes out, I'd say, it's starting to grow around the early 2000s. I'm trained as an analytic philosopher. There's really very few analytic philosophers that do video game studies, but we're a small growing number of people. I'm, one of a few dozen, I think.
Are you going to continue this work?
Yes. So
Okay.
I have a second book that's on the way. It's just a general account of the aesthetics of video games. And I'm really looking forward to finishing that.
You're working on it now then?
Yes.
So, and what do you see to be the future of this field? I mean, obviously it's gonna continue to grow, I would think.
I mean, the thing with this field is that the future of it is really bound to the technology. It's really bound to what the technology does next, and the next big thing is going to be VR.
Right.
Which is already, there are already a few scholars that are doing some genuinely groundbreaking work in VR studies. That's really fascinating. So I'll just quickly mention, I know a psychologist who does work on how people make moral choices. And it turns out that we make moral choices very differently if you're playing a video game on a console where you've got a controller in your hand, or if you're playing the video game in virtual reality.
Right.
Because your body is involved in making these choices, it becomes harder to do bad things. It becomes a more emotional reaction.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you've inspired me. I think I'm going to go home and dig out my old Game Boy and see
Excellent.
what I can do this evening. But I appreciate you coming,
Well,
Dr.
thanks for having
Bartell,
me.
Chris, my colleague, and the book is Video Games, Violence, and the Ethics of Fantasy, Killing Time. And
That's what we've been doing, killing time.
you've actually written this, you say, for the general reader, so don't be afraid of it because it's a philosophy book. It's very accessible.
No, I wrote it. I write everything with my dad in mind. He was a
great.
truck driver,
Yeah.
so I write everything as a letter to my dad.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, this is Ozzy Ostwald. Until next time, I hope you'll join us again on Religion and Life when we continue to study the overlay between religion, culture, and society. Until then, good night.